It is truly a unique honor to introduce Ms. Pandith for this most appropriate event for a pressing issue, countering violent extremism, preventing the spread of radical ideologies. Born in Kashmir, Ms. Pandith was raised and educated in Massachusetts, receiving her bachelor's degree from Smith College and her master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She specialized in international security studies, Islamic civilizations, Southwest Asia, and international negotiation and conflict resolution. In the time frame from 1997 to 2003, Ms. Pandith served as Vice President of International Business for ML Strategies in Boston. She then went on to spend 2 months in Afghanistan, developing a public outreach strategy as a Chief of Staff of the Bureau for Asia and Near East for the U.S. Agency for International Development. From 2004 to 2007, Ms. Pandith served as the Director for Middle East Regional Initiatives for the National Security Council at the White House. Most recently, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton appointed Ms. Pandith as the first ever Special Representative to Muslim communities in June of 2009. The Office of the Special Representative was responsible for engaging with Muslims around the world, relying primarily on interpersonal interaction. Throughout her career, she has remained focused and steadfast on driving efforts towards counter-extremism globally. Thank you so much, Ms. Pandith, for being here tonight. It is such an honor, and we're beyond fortunate to have you at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. Please join me in giving Ms. Pandith a very warm welcome. Thank you so much.
So good evening to everybody. It's very, very nice to be on this beautiful campus on a warm day with the sun shining. I wasn't prepared for that, so thank you for doing that. Such power. I would really like to thank both David and Steve for inviting me here today and being part of this special group of people who are thinking broadly about how millennials can be thinking about the world in new and exciting ways. There's nothing more important than making sure that we infuse into the way they think about the world the different challenges both in our country and around the world. And I hope today's conversation will be one that allows us to get new ideas on the table and for you to hear a little bit about the journey that our country has taken in terms of the ideology that we've been fighting in earnest since 9/11. So what I thought we would do today is I will speak to you for about 15 or 20 minutes and give you a broad range of moments along the way and how we've thought about the challenge of combating violent extremism, what's been new in the last few years, and how we should be thinking about things going forward. You heard from Michael, very kind introduction, thank you. But I've come to this field not with a thrill and an earnestness of, isn't this great to do? I'm so sorry that this is the wheelhouse that we are dealing with. I will say, spoiler alert, I believe that the extremists are going to lose. And I believe that we have the tools to defeat them. I believe that they're affordable, and I believe that they're available. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But where did this all start? For many of you in the audience who are undergrads, you were very young when 9/11 happened. But as we think about the terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda, obviously this is not new to the scene. At 9/11, we heard about them both at the USS Cole time and with the attack on the World Trade Center in '93, so this was not a new group. But I will say to you that after 9/11, our country began to think about the narrative that Al-Qaeda was using to persuade others to join their organization and indeed impact who we are as Americans and others around the world. This ideology, so to speak, the ideology of the extremist, was defined in the Bush administration as the war of ideas, a terminology not everybody wanted to celebrate, but it's something that I actually think describes very clearly how we think about the push and the pull. The other conversation you heard about an ideological struggle that was happening, by the way, at the same time was Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations that he wrote in 1993 in Foreign Affairs. There are a lot of people who are nodding their heads. They know this. Why am I bringing this up? Because when 9/11 happened, we heard a lot in America about why they hate, Why do they hate us? Why they do hate us? What we must do so they don't hate us, right? We did not have a broad conversation about the ideology of extremists that has been moving around the world in different ways, that manifested on 9/11 in a very particular way. But I say that to you because it's important as we look at things in 2015 to watch the trajectory of that conversation, because it is not just about AQ. It is about the ideology of different extremist groups that are pushing and persuading millennials to join their armies. Their armies both online and offline. They're both physical armies and they're virtual armies. In the Bush administration, our country was thinking about how to fight the war of ideas in a very precise way. We began to think a lot about the voices that could push back against the ideologies that Al-Qaeda was putting out there, the ideologies of us versus them. Now, what I'm talking about today is what we would call soft power, okay? And I'm not here to talk about what was happening in the hard power space. We can spend a lot of time debating that. But I'm talking about the soft power pieces. How do we get into the mind of the ideology that was moving these young people? They're not separate. There are connections, of course. But this idea of us versus them was the paradigm that we were working from. We learned very early on in the Bush administration that indeed, obviously, the American government had absolutely no credibility to get into the game of the ideology. Who did have credibility to be able to do that? Well, we began by building the list of people you would imagine. The countries, the world organizations that were really important, and we started checking them off. What Muslim majority countries could we say were fighting and pushing back against AQ? Yep, Saudi Arabia said bad. Yes, this group said bad. The Sheikh of Al-Azhar said bad, and we felt very good about ourselves. We went through that list and we began to see that they were saying things. But guess what? Just because a Muslim majority nation that we think is important says something doesn't mean all Muslims around the world fall in line and say, yes, indeed, they said that, therefore I'm not going to do anything. There was something else going on. And as we were trying to figure out what was going on, what happened in 2006? The Danish cartoon crisis. The Danish cartoon crisis happens in 2006, and oh my goodness, something that happened in Copenhagen affected a life in Kabul. And we, the United States, were completely unprepared, not to speak of the Danes, not to speak of the Europeans. And we began to understand in 2015, we get this. Things are connected around the world. But in 2006, we didn't. We didn't have that perspective that things were shaping in a new way. So the ideological impact of the narrative of Al-Qaeda was transforming the way in which we thought about what was happening at the grassroots. Not only were the Europeans freaking out because they couldn't understand what was happening there, but we were also, as Americans, doing this internal review of how do we begin to push back against this ideology if we aren't a credible source? Who are the credible sources? We began to shift and develop a new approach. What was that approach? It was finding credible voices, those people that were going to make a difference to Michael's generation at the time, the young people who were 20 years old around the world, people that we normally did not say, boy, you're going to make a difference to the way that person thinks. Hip-hop artists, graffiti artists, social entrepreneurs, athletes, others that made sense. And we began to talent scout around the world to figure out who were these voices that we could be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we heard on the ground. And by spending time developing that sort of roadmap of the kinds of voices on the ground, we began to see some subtle changes that were happening on the ground ideologically that could begin to push back. Now, it was a prototype. It was an opportunity for us to explore what we would think about if we thought about that ideological component. Now, why is that important to what's happening today? Some of the networks of like-minded thinkers that we began to build in Europe, those people that were connected, the person in Madrid with the person in Oslo, the person in Sicily with the person in Brussels, beginning to do things that were pushing back against the ideology, we were tying them together in ways that we had never seen before. Not only had we not done this before, but the Europeans had not done this before. And we began to see that if we put smart people around the world who were of the right generation, who had the right creativity, who had the right innovation, we could begin to see them standing out front, pushing back against the ideology that was seeping into their communities. We began to do what everybody in this room understands, is that in order for change to happen, it has to happen at an extremely local level. We had to understand the landscape, not just within Spain or within Indonesia, but within particular cities and neighborhoods in those places. Because something that was happening in Barcelona was not the same that was happening in Madrid. Now, it may seem really obvious to you now, but it wasn't so obvious to us then. And as we began to experiment on the kinds of initiatives that happened on the ground, we understood several things. One, the US government had to do more to spend time on the ground through our embassies by going deep and going wide, beginning to understand the impact and the nuances of community to community. Two, we needed to bring forward absolutely new kind of talent, the voices on the ground that we are normally would not say, come on board, we want to talk to you. We had to be comfortable with those people that we weren't always engaging with. The red line, of course, is violence, but we were not saying, I'm not going to talk to you because you don't like our country. We were willing to talk to innovators and creatives and different kinds of people that all shared the common belief that they did not want this ideology in their backyard. And three, we began to do something so important that sadly and tragically is connected to where we are today. We began to understand how important the voice of women were. Okay? We understood that we had to get the mothers on board, that we had to understand that they were the canary in the coal mine, that they were seeing things that many others didn't understand. So by the time we got to about 2009, we were just beginning to get our sea legs around this ideological thing. We were just beginning to build the kind of thinking around credible voices pushing back. When President Obama became president, his vision was very, very large in terms of engagement with Muslims, and it wasn't built upon a perspective that was around terrorism. It was around engagement. 1/4 of our planet is Muslim, 1.6 billion people. 62% of that number is under the age of 30. That's the demographic from which the bad guys recruit. That is a large demographic, and it is important for us to build connectivity not just around terrorism, but around education and entrepreneurship and other things that can build bridges together. So during the course of the comprehensive, holistic approach with engagement with Muslims, we began to think about things in a very, very different way. One, globally. We understood that a voice in Stockholm was as important as a voice in Surabaya. There were more Muslims that lived outside of the Middle East than in it. How do you give respect to all those voices? Are we indeed building initiatives that broadened our scope and made us understand more diligently how we think about who those voices might be? And how do we assess and move forward on a really critical component that I saw firsthand when I was doing work in Europe, which is what was happening to the millennial generation? What is the one data point that is consistent with young millennials all around the world who happen to be Muslim? Anybody here know? Well, yes, for sure, they're digital natives. What's one characteristic that connects every young person under the age of 30 that happens to be Muslim? A crisis of identity. And that is something that we don't talk a lot about, but it is critical to the subject we're talking about today. Now, while there are many places that we wanted to connect and many things we wanted to do in a forward-looking way, when you began to look at what was happening to millennial Muslims and you began to understand that every single day since September 12, 2001, this is a generation that has seen the word Islam or Muslim on the front pages of papers, online and offline. It has significantly changed the way they think about themselves and think about how others perceive them. They are asking questions that their parents and their grandparents didn't ask. Now, Everybody goes through a crisis of identity when they're growing up. I get that. Who am I? What am I supposed to do with my life? But if the only answer you're getting when you're asking what's the difference between culture and religion, or what does it mean to be modern and Muslim, or how can I be a, quote, good Muslim, unquote, is the answer that's given to you by Sheikh Google, you're in trouble. And why are you in trouble? Because the loudest voices in the spaces that millennials are going were not with the credible voices I've just described. They were with the bad guys. The bad guys were online saying, you want to be a better Muslim? Let me show you how to do this. You must dress like this, you must pray like this, you must eat like this, you must be like this. Now, when you're having a crisis of identity and you are really leaning in a direction that says, give me purity, give me an answer, give me something that I can hold on to, the sharp, sophisticated, extremely polished answers by the bad guys that are getting more and more polished by the moment was providing an opportunity for these young people to move in a direction. Do you remember the underwear bomber? Yeah? He went online. This is a guy who comes from Nigeria, who is an affluent kid, whose family, his father was a banker in Nigeria. He was educated in the UK. He was actually in the UK studying. And he went online to ask this question: why does my family not eat halal meat? Now, you might ask yourself, why doesn't he ask his mom and dad? Why doesn't he ask his brother or sister? Why does our family not eat halal meat? Why did he go to an external source to get an answer to that question? Because in the generation we're talking about, you're not going to your mom and dad and your grandparents and your cousins and your whatever. You're going to your peers, or you're going to Sheikh Google, okay? When we begin to understand that this is the phenomenon that's taking place with millennials, and we understand that the bad guys know that that crisis of identity is providing an opportunity for them to answer questions, we begin to see the problem that we're facing today. In the context of what's happening on the planet in 2015, the things that I am talking about have manifested in a really aggressive, crazy way. The group ISIS is a very particular type of terrorist organization, it is true. But one could argue that whether you're Al-Qaeda, whether you're Al-Shabaab, whether you're Boko Haram, whether you're ISIS or any of the other groups that fit in the category of terrorists, you know that you are seducing, you're going after a very particular demographic, and that is young Muslims, to build your armies, both intellectually and virtually. Virtually and physically. And you also know that the skills that will allow you to move your ideas forward need to be in a medium that makes sense for the millennial generation. So when we understand the boiling pot and all the things that are taking place within the crisis of identity and what the bad guys know that they have to do, and you ask yourself the question, well, what do we as Americans, what does the United States government do and other governments around the world do to fix this problem? You have to go back to the basics. And the basics mean, what kind of strategy are you building to prevent this kind of ideology from going forward? And toward that end, the strategies that we have been building so far have been ad hoc, and they have been uneven. The American government, along with other governments in the world, have, as many have described, it's sort of a whack-a-mole kind of thing. Something is happening over there, something is happening over there, we're going to go in and we're going to try to deal with it. But in fact, if I could leave you with anything today, it is not about a region. It is not about a region. It is about a global ideology that is seducing young Muslims from Brazil to Australia, that is moving the minds of young people and corrupting the way they think about themselves in a way that obviously is not only dangerous for us and our bottom line, but is recalibrating and reshaping the future of what it means to be Muslim on the planet. Clearly, these groups are not defining religion. They are not theological groups. They are terrorist groups that are using the name of Islam to sell their wares. We get that. But what we have to understand is for governments, for policymakers, to be able to get into this game and be able to win the war of ideas, we have to have a strategy that is a global strategy, one that is extremely local, that is online and offline. But here's the kicker: that doesn't come from the United States. It doesn't come from the UK. It doesn't come from Saudi Arabia. It doesn't come from any government in the world, because the creatives and the innovation have to come from outside of a nation state. And that is where we have failed, because no government on earth has the credibility to put their time into this and get the kind of return on their investment that they can. Because it is a very, we have to be very nimble and very malleable in how we think about the reaction and how we are proactive in terms of the kinds of tools that we need on the ground. That means that the greatest strength of the United States government at this moment is to do two things. One is, yes, to accept the fact that a soft power strategy is important, but the people that will implement it have got to be outside of government. This is not something we hear a lot about. We hear a lot about of how much money and time is the United States government putting in to building a communication center that's going to compete with ISIS tweets. We hear a lot about how we can go at the grassroots and build programs that we think are going to, it's all good stuff. It's not that we cannot and should not do that. It's to maximize the opportunity for us to get ahead of an ISIS or whatever comes next. It means that what we must do with civil society is to change the architecture in all of your minds about what this threat is. This is not something that the government must fix. This is a global threat. The way a health concern is a global threat, you think about it differently. When we think about, I like to think a lot about in the 1980s when HIV/AIDS came to the table. You will remember that we were not only scared, we were really freaked out because we knew nothing about it, but we also didn't know how to deal with educating people. And we knew that education was the most important part. But we couldn't talk about it. We couldn't talk about HIV/AIDS because it had something to do with sex. We couldn't say that out loud. And we couldn't say condom out loud because in 1986 we didn't want to talk about that. So we pushed it away and things began to get much worse. And then all of a sudden civil society said, we need to do more to educate. What happened? The faith community got on board. They're like, we've got to educate. Educators began to think differently. You began to see politicians and policymakers think differently. You began to see civil society think differently about how you think about new solutions to the problem of HIV/AIDS. It is true the American government put a lot of money into solutions in the science front, right? Obviously. But 20 years later, we're at a place where the President of the United States can stand in the Rose Garden at the podium and say condom and sex and HIV/AIDS and nobody bats an eyelash. What we have to do is normalize the conversation about extremism so that innovative ideas come to the table, on online ideas and offline ideas, because the best ideas, the most nimble ideas, will come from outside of government to be activated, and they will have more authenticity and they will be more robust. So when I think about the threat that we face with the ideology of the extremists, whether we're talking about Boko Haram or we're talking about ISIS or we're talking about Al-Qaeda, and we're talking about the issue of combating violent extremism, I leave you with three important thoughts. One is you can make a difference on this. I'm not being cute, but you can. And I know this firsthand, because some of the most incredible ideas that I've seen work on the ground did not come from government. They came from the person who said, you know what? I'm dealing with young people and we have this thing that might work, and have you tried that? And boy, it's going gangbusters in Britain, or it's working really well in Australia, or it's working really well in Pakistan in this tiny little community. Why don't we scale up those ideas? Okay? The second thing, absolutely, that you have to understand clearly as we think about this threat is the opportunity to be nimble means that we need to be generating the kinds of conversations that are forward-thinking, not backward-thinking. We are playing defense. We are catching up to what the bad guys are doing. Let me give you a very concrete example. Everybody in America freaked out when they saw 3 girls from Denver, Colorado that were willing to get on a plane and go off to fight ISIS. Oh my God, everybody said. Girls can get recruited? Really? I mean, come on. If you're the bad guy and you're thinking about how to build your army, wouldn't you recruit women? You are thinking about sustainable ideology over time. Of course they're going to recruit women. Of course they're going to be nimble and sophisticated about how to draw that young teenage girl in online. We should have been ahead of that curve. So we need to be thinking about what's happening next, and we need to be ready for it. And the third thing for sure, and this comes right home to here in Chicago, you have unbelievable innovators in this city. People who for their day jobs think out of the box. They put a hard task on the table and they move the parts until they come up with creative things. What I urge Americans to do, and I've been saying this as loudly as I can, stop waiting for others to do this. Bring those communities of innovators together. Bring business, bring theologians, bring others together and say, our kids in America are being recruited. They are being seduced. How do we stop that? And let's build a fortification so that our country and other countries around the world do not have to deal with the threat of this ideology for the next generations to come. This is a solvable idea. This whole project of fighting the extremists is a solvable thing. The question we have to do is ask ourselves, why aren't we doing more? With that, I'm going to pause and open it up for the next phase. Yes.
Thank you so much, Farah. We want to take questions and comments, but I want to actually use a moderator's prerogative and just ask a follow-up or two. So when it comes to the crisis of identity, what have you come to understand about what these organizations, whether it's ISIS or Boko Haram, know and are doing so effectively to actually appeal to young Muslims around the world?
So not to be funny about it, but their craftiness and sophistication comes in the same way an advertiser would try to sell a kid Kool-Aid or something. They're listening and watching what's trending. They're understanding what's going to appeal. They're speaking many, not actual languages, which they are obviously, but they're different kinds of kids. So for the kid who they need theological arguments, they go in a theological way. For the kid who wants something to do and wants to be the hero, they go after that kind of child. Or young adult. For the person who knows very little about what they want to do with their future, they provide answers. You can be a this and you can be a that. They're giving them a vision for themselves and a vision for the world that makes sense to them. And by the way, they're doing this 24/7. They aren't just doing it in the working hours that people go to work. They're doing this fully. They have people of their generation, peer-to-peer, that have been mobilized in a consistent way. And I think until we understand the power of that, we will never be able to get ahead of where they are, which is why we need, one of my students at Harvard said to me, I was teaching a class on countering violent extremism, and she was listening to this crisis of identity, and she was listening to, well, how do you do it? What do you build? How are you going to get out there? And I'm telling her about initiatives, and we do this, and she's still looking at me, and then she said, Farah, when you speak to millennials, what you need to tell them is that you're building Dumbledore's army. That you are indeed building Dumbledore's army. And for those of you who don't know Harry Potter, shame on you. But the ability for each person to use their wand in the way that they know how to actually make a difference will actually be able to build the kind of groundswell that we need. And so what they're doing is they're ahead of us, not just in numbers online, but in terms of the appeal, the craftiness, and the sexiness, to use a very frank term.
I have more questions. I'm sure you do as well. So let me actually open up the floor to those here who have questions and comments. Yes, sir, you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. Looking in the mirror, 2 questions. Does Islamophobia in America have an impact on these recruiting strategies? And is there a discussion in the establishment about how to combat Islamophobia in America?
So that's a term that I have a real problem with, and I'll tell you why. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. So I don't use that term, but I think I know the direction you're going. There's some data points for you. First of all, right now in 2015, there are the numbers, if you look at what research groups are saying around hate in general, it is appalling that humanity is in the place that they are today. For lots of different groups, whether it's LGBT, whether it is the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, which is off the charts, all kinds of things are happening. So you're seeing the push and the pull of communities that want to hate the other, whatever that other might happen to be. It is part of the ecosystem that is going on right now, and of course, extremists are going to use the victim mentality to move people in a particular direction. Obviously, we do not want communities that have hate. We push back against that. We want to do as much building of mutual respect as we possibly can across the board. So I absolutely hope that it's not just you shouldn't not like that person because of their religion, because the bad guys can come in, but it's because it's not the right thing to do, right? We need to do more to saturate our communities and open up the kinds of conversations where we're rejecting stereotypes and all of that kind of stuff. I do think that the data will tell you also that for a lot of young Muslims in our country, so I am in my mid-40s. I grew up as an American. I grew up as a Muslim. My experience of growing up in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is nowhere like anything a young 11-year-old Muslim girl is dealing with right now. It's just night and day. The experiences are very, very different. So you cannot turn a blind eye to the changes that have happened in our country and the experience and the frame that's happening within our country because of all the things I've just talked about, but because of what we know is happening right now. So I do know that feeling of somehow I'm really different and there's an extra burden on me does shape the way the extremists do use their ability online to say, come to a community in which you will always belong. It is the purer place. It is a place that you will feel safe. So there are connections to your question. I'm answering this in a very long way, I apologize. But there are connections to that, and it would be foolhardy to say there isn't. But I don't like the idea of a correlation because that.
Other questions here? Yeah, we have a hand right back there.
Hi, thank you for coming today. As a young Muslim in America, it's really hard to see something that you either fully identify with or partially identify with, like attacked all the time in the media. So do you think that a successful strategy for fighting ISIS and their victimization complex, that we should rid the use of like Islamic terrorists and just deem them as terrorists and try not to identify the religion with it? So young Muslims aren't encouraged to join because of their religion if it's not religious based.
So I really wish life was that simple. I really wish it's the exact lexicon that's going to make the difference to this whole thing. I will tell you lexicon matters, and I'll give you a couple of examples where it's made a huge difference, in my view. And you might think this is just, I'm so in the weeds, but understand what I'm saying. When I was in graduate school, the terminology Muslim world was used all the time. I used it. It's the way we thought about Muslims around the world. Arab world, Muslim world, Arab world, Muslim world. Well, I'd like to meet the Muslim world. I've never seen it before. And it is something that creates this us and them mentality. It's as if Muslims are in a little petri dish and they all live in the same way and act in the same way. It's quite offensive if you actually think about it. We designed, think about how President Obama in the Cairo speech spoke. His words were really important. The lexicon that he used was essential. He talked about Muslim communities around the world for a reason. It wasn't just an ad hoc thing that he threw together. The precise way in which the president was giving dignity to all voices matters to the way in which we as Americans think about each other and about how the president spearheads the way in which he wants us to think. We have gotten into the minutia, and it's a very political conversation right now about what kind of terrorists and what needs to whatever, and the president has held firm. And he's talked very clearly about extremists, and he's been very defined in the kind of language that he's using, and he's rejecting the idea of connecting religion with this for a very important reason. Let me say to you that when I became special representative to Muslim communities, do you know the first thing I did? And as somebody who feels so privileged, I got an incredible education in this country. I went to private schools from the time I was 6 years old until I finished. And I thought I knew a lot. I knew nothing about Islam in America, really, truly nothing. And one of the first things I did was I worked with a historian to help me understand, talk to me about presidents, Islam, and diplomacy. I want to learn what our founding fathers said about Islam. I want to know what actually what the trajectory was of conversations in our nation, this great nation that we call home. What was said? Why was it said? Why am I telling you this? Because from President George Washington all the way to our current president, there has not been one president that has not spoken in an ill way about the religion of Islam. They have been noble. They have been dignified. They have been caring about the words that they choose. And whether you're President Reagan or Carter during the time of the Iran hostage crisis, or you're President Obama right now, they have been above the fray, and they have talked about this in a way that is setting the stage. So I say this to you because while lexicon absolutely matters, and I urge you to be careful about how you think about the us and the them, all of us, as we speak about this, does it make sense that we do this? I don't particularly think it's going to make a difference for your generation to say, because what I just said to this gentleman about you waking up every day, seeing the word Islam or Muslim on the front pages of papers, I get that, and this is what you experienced. But how do you push back against that as a young person right now, as an American, I would assume, maybe? I hear from your accent. You're an American. I think that the thing to do is to be able to be bold and strong in the words that you use to reject it. You can build that groundswell to say, that isn't in my name, and that's, let me tell you what it means to be an American who happens to be Muslim, and define things in your own way. There are enough of you in our country that can push back against the madness.
We had 2 hands up over here, and we also have some hands in the back. So,
Hi, thank you for coming today. Earlier you talked about the idea that ideas will probably not come from government and will come from other people. But then who then has the legitimacy and capability of enforcing or implementing those ideas, like government or international organizations or people in communities and individuals?
There's some things governments must do. They must push on the harder end of things with sanctions and with the relationships with countries and how you think about policy and diplomacy, and there are things that government can do, okay, for sure. I'm not saying government can't do anything. But in terms of ideas that are seeded, you don't have to be a scholar of Islam to come up with a cool idea on how to be able to make sure a young kid doesn't find something appealing, do you? Right? What I'm simply saying is the good news right now in 2015, and there's very good news on the subject that we're talking about today, we've done a lot of research. It is not like we are where we were right after 9/11, wringing our hands going, what do we do? What do we do? What's the ideology? What are some initiatives that we've done so much? There's so much data collection on how somebody gets radicalized, what they do online and offline, who the influencers are. I mean, we have bucket loads of information out there in terms of all of this stuff. The research is there. What we don't have are the people that can connect the dots to say, wow, if I'm noticing that in X city, the demographic between the age of 17 and 23 is doing this type of thing, and you're drilling down. What do we do to be able to provide an alternative to that? Who are the most credible voices anywhere in the world on this subject? Former extremists. People that have walked the walk and have come back and said, by the way, I was in Syria, I want to talk to you about it. Or I used to work for Lashkar-e-Taiba. Or I was part of Boko Haram, or I'm former FARC, or I'm former IRA. These are people who have walked the walk, who have been seduced, who understand. There's a network right now called Against Violent Extremism of former extremists from around the world. What can somebody who is interested in this field do? Work with them to get their stories out. You don't have to be a Muslim or an Islamic scholar to be able to do that. So like that, there are so many different types of ways you can absolutely get involved.
We had a hand up straight right behind you, Liz, actually. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to synthesize all of what I wanted to ask and say thank you for everything that you said today, because it was really, I appreciate it a lot. But as a Muslim who grew up wearing the hijab, living in Houston, in the South, what's really important to me in the idea of like discussing millennial Muslims around the world is the idea of collective trauma, and the idea that there's like a diaspora of like Muslims living in the U.S. now that are not the same as the generations of Muslims who like first came to this country, who live here and are like have a deep disconnect from their communities, from what their parents deem their homelands, from and the sort of trauma that comes along with that, and also the collective trauma of what they are going through nowadays, seeing in, like as you mentioned in the news, like seeing Islam and Muslim all the time and having this bombardment of what their identity should be. And the thing about trauma and the thing about this collective experience, like as an example, my 12-year-old younger brother was asked in his history class to like explain what the terrorists on 9/11 said, and this idea where you have to be justifying yourself every single day. And so what that brought to me as a thought while you were speaking is whenever you said the word bad guys, I had the quotes around it, because I feel like phrasing it as bad guys takes responsibility away from the US government as well, in the terms of like knowing that like there are families overseas that are like being hurt in the bombs that are supposed to be going after the terrorists and are getting civilians in the like on the wayside, like not intentionally, but like it is the trauma that is happening to this collective community. And the way to go about healing trauma is acknowledgement. And I want to know where the place for that is in this counter-extremism movement, where the place for acknowledging the trauma that this community is experiencing and working towards healing it as a way of taking away that source for the quote-unquote bad guys to exploit it and say, well, they're not acknowledging your trauma, but we will, and taking that away from them.
I think
Sorry.
that's good. No, I think we got it. That's Farah, what's your sense of that?
It's a great question, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you sharing the personal story about your brother, which is really hard to hear, right? I mean, 12 years old. That's a very hard story. So, this line, if I can synthesize what you said, what you're really asking is, at what point does any government, whether it's our government or somebody else, say, because we did this, this is happening right now? I kind of reject some of that, okay? Because I've seen conspiracy theories and I've seen the manipulation of facts in so many different landscapes around this country, around this world. I don't know nobody is absorbing, wow, the United States did these 10 things, and so therefore they've accepted it, and that's fine, check. This president has been really clear on a lot of different things that were very different from the president before, yet nothing has changed. I'm not saying, I don't want to have a political conversation with you about who did what where, because we can go back, by the way, hundreds of years in terms of the colonizers and I really have heard it all. I have heard it all. We are here because, and I heard a story about something that happened 700 years ago, and that is why we are here. Whatever part of history you want to take, there's enough blame to go around, absolutely. But the larger and more important question is a political one, and that is a judgment for any president of our country to decide how he or her, in any way, is going to digest what it is they're hearing about a particular thing. And by the way, you said, I'm going to poke now at you. You said the trauma of the community. Boy, there's a lot of trauma for many communities of all shapes and sizes around the world that things are connected to. So it isn't a formulaic answer that if we acknowledge X, this will go here, and it will be very hard, I think, for us to find a way to put the balm on somebody's wound to completely heal it in a moment. It doesn't work like that. I wish it did.
As a follow-up, though, thinking about the hard power, soft power dynamic, to what extent do hard power actions actually undermine soft power strategies, right?
So that's really a great point. Yes, there are places that one can point to in recent memory of this made this happen. This blew that open, and that's why. But the underlying ecosystem, if you want to talk about hard power and soft power, how do we think about? Now we're talking purely America now in this. Our country when we're looking at the hard power, it's not just about the war or wars that we may have gotten involved in recent history, or the story that I hear all the time is we're the one who created AQ and we created it. I mean, like, it goes back and back and back and back. Okay. But as policymakers also, we need to be really clear about how the ecosystem is being built. What has been happening for the last 30 years on the planet that has allowed extremist ideologies to seep into communities around the world that have made them ripe and ready for things to happen. It's not just about what happened, 15 years ago or 10 years ago. It's a layer upon layer of a lot of different things that have shaped the landscape, as you well know.
Let's take some other questions. Yeah, we have a hand up here. He's been patient.
Yeah, could you just discuss moderate Islam and what are the leaders of the center of the Islamic religion doing to get involved in this, and particularly with the millenniums?
Moderate, I don't know what a moderate is. I talk about mainstream Muslims. I push back on lexicon. I'm sorry to do it. It's just a habit now because I get very... I've heard this a lot, and so have you. We talk about it a lot. If only there were a council of 50 people or 10 or 5 that really, if they said everything, everybody would fall into place. It hasn't worked like that. What I will say has changed, and specifically in our country. Right after 9/11, you didn't hear, you heard some voices come forward to reject and scream. There was a lot of fear. All kinds of things were going on. But today in 2015, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of people and movements and initiatives that have happened in our country where we see people pushing back against the extremist ideology and say, in a lot of different kinds of ways. Similarly, sir, that has happened in other parts of the world. But there isn't, I kind of joked when I began my talk about that list of people that we want to feel comfortable about. And by the way, they've all said extremism is bad. They've all said AQ, ISIS, Boko, Al-Shabaab, name your group, needs to be eradicated. It hasn't changed the game. Millennials need to hear from their peers that this is what's happening to their generation and why it's happening, and they need to be given the tools to be able to push back against it. It isn't just about the grand mufti of this mosque or the Arab League or the OIC or the head of whatever group. It isn't just about that. That's important to us from a policy level. We as policymakers want to say, look at all the great allies and friends that we have saying that. Important, I'm not going to dismiss it, but for the granularity that's happening on the ground at the grassroots civil society level, that isn't changing. That's not a game changer.
I mean, just to follow up there, it sounds like, too, going back to your public health analogy, that you're trying to create a new norm, right, around what's accepted behavior. Yes. And what's an accepted set of responses to certain stimuli or conditions in which you find yourself. Right?
And to blast open what's really taking place, to use that analogy, you had to really understand how people got that disease. You had to be able to talk about it. And then you could provide the safe sex option, right? When you talk about extremism, we aren't having a clear conversation about what we've learned about how the bad guys are doing what they're doing and what their narratives are. We haven't provided enough information to parents, for example, about what to look out for, what to see. You have to give parents, we haven't even talked about that, I'm sorry, I should have used that example earlier. Parents are really vital to this. And what I talked about with women being the canary in the coal mine, they are the first ones that see the change in their child. And by the way, because the bad guys are now, in quotes, my friend, are recruiting women, they're moving. If you change a mother and you make her more a particular way, what do you think she does to her household? She tells her husband, you're not, come on, start getting with the program. Change a little bit. She tells her kid, what kind of kid are you playing with? Is he a Sunni or is he a Shia? Is he a Jew? Is he a Christian? Is he a mother plays a gigantic role in a house. So when we begin to think about the anecdote, how do we recalibrate the game? The piece on women is really, really important.
What should parents know? What should they be watching for in this context?
I think that we need to have an open discussion about the information we understand. That's how many kids are going to bad sites, what they're seeing, what our parents, or the way we look at sexual predators, the way we look at any other threat that we see online. We're not including that in the conversation. As a parent, you need to be aware of what they do and what triggers this. But also, it's not just the education that happens in, quote, a mosque. I mean, this is what people think, it only and I hear over and over again, it's some kid in the garage, hiding away. I'm sorry, the kid is at Starbucks on his phone or her phone doing this. It's like not hiding off in the basement, it's in plain sight. So we need to talk about where this stuff is happening and what changes are happening. We haven't integrated the social scientists and the psychologists and the educators together around these issues. So we have to normalize and mainstream this.
We have other hands. Yeah. Yeah. I'll get you a microphone. Yeah. My monopolization.
Just follow. What about what commonality do you see among the kids who have become susceptible to this? Are there common threads that you can point to?
There's only one common thread, and that is they're seeking belonging, this crisis of identity. And it manifests in a lot of different ways, and one could say, no, that's that person wants the caliphate, and so they're going for the caliphate. Well, actually, at the very granular level, that first step that they're taking is belonging. It's I want to have meaning. I want to understand that ache that I have inside of me that I don't feel like I fit in, I belong, is being answered. And that's what the bad guys are doing. And David, here's the spooky part for me. When I was special representative, as you know, I traveled all around the world. I went to 80 countries around the world. And I would think that data point would only be in places that maybe Muslims live as a minority. They think, oh gosh, I don't have a belonging. This was happening in places with Muslim majority. And that frightened me. And it frightened me because these are places that have a heritage and culture of Islam, so that they should have the infrastructure around them that prevents them from being confused. But I was seeing this. I was seeing this in Pakistan. I was seeing it in Malaysia. I was seeing it in Indonesia. And when you begin to understand that, you understand it's the demographic. It isn't the region of the world, and so this crisis of identity is the one data point.
We have lots of other hands to get to. One straight in the back, and I'll go up here to the front and then back to you. Yeah.
Good evening. Thanks for the presentation. I'm an MBA alum of this university. I'm also an American Muslim. I've been a Chicagoan for 30 years, and I've been part of a process whereby we define what it means to be an American Muslim. And now I have teenager kids. You're talking about parenting, Steve. I have teenager kids, and I've helped them define what it means to be American Muslims. So for us, there are multiple identities, being Chicagoan, Kashmiri, Pakistani, so on and so forth. What I don't see, and my kids were educated in full-time Islamic schools in the US. That's part of their identity. What I don't see happening in this whole narrative and discussion about engagement with the Muslim world is exclusion of American Muslims. American Muslims happen to be the most educated, the most engaged, civically engaged in the Muslim world, in the Western world, but we are often ignored. Our narrative, we have been fighting this war for 30 years, individually and collectively. And when we talk about these extremists who are recruiting these people in the name of our faith, your faith and my faith, well, we need to take the battle to them. We need to beat them at their own game. I have helped my kids define their identity in terms of Islam by falling back to Islam. So we don't talk about, oh, look, what they're saying is wrong. That's reactionary. This is not how you raise kids. You give them the framework so they are confident of who they are, and none of this nonsense about extremism, so on and so forth, influences them. Your comments, please.
Well, so first of all, I want to thank you for your comment. I think what you've done with your children in terms of defining for them within.
The whole community in Chicago was doing that, not just me.
Well, then what I would say to you is scale it up.
We have been.
Oh,
30 years.
I want you to scale it up more. I think it's great. If it's a model that works,
We are not part of the discussion, unfortunately. When the U.S. government talks about it, American Muslims are often ignored.
So I'm going to push back on you just a little bit, okay? Just because I don't want to get into a debate, but I want to broaden the frame because I think President Obama has done some pretty great engagement in our country with Muslims from the moment he started his efforts to try to open up the conversation. I talked about the initiative that he's put into place. There's a global side that he's doing a lot of things with our embassies around the world, okay? But there's also a lot that he's done with faith communities within the United States, all over the United States, asking all kinds of faith communities to come to the table so that he can hear their voices and understand what's going on. And we can absolutely talk offline, and I can give you very specific examples of where you can get involved, and I can give you the people that you should get involved with if you feel like you haven't been reached out to. But I want to say to you that there is a very robust and very clear attention to the importance of faith communities in our country, and the president has been very clear about that, not just in public spaces talking about it, but in terms of actual delivery on the ground.
We have a hand up here, and then we'll come back to you, and we'll close.
Hi, thank you again for being here. I intern right now at the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism across the street, and a lot of our rhetoric is touching on the idea of occupation and autonomy, affecting the ideology behind joining some of these organizations, just sort of like wanting to be able to have your own voice in things and decide who you want to be, going back to what you mentioned before on trying to find your place as you are growing into a young adult. So I wanted to get your opinion on to what extent do you think, and you mentioned this briefly earlier with the hard power, soft power, to what extent do you think that like this idea of autonomy, which we see playing out in the world with, you know, we have Western powers in certain places in the world, do you think that that has an effect on drawing young people to join these organizations on the basis of autonomy and wanting to sort of like be their own person? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So you're saying that you, define this for me, you're saying that you think that people are joining the terrorist groups because they want to have more autonomy, or because, I'm sorry, I got confused.
That's okay. Yeah, that's kind of like the rhetoric, just the idea of like occupation, sort of like fostering idea of like nationalism.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah.
No, it's
that.
my fault. I think that there is a correlation. There is that some sense of sort of purpose and being and rejecting every connection to anything else. But I don't think that's the only factor in it, to be honest with you.
I promised this hand back here that he'd have the opportunity to ask the last question, so I'll make sure that he has that opportunity.
Hi. First of all, thank you for being here. So you've talked a lot about, you know, these entrepreneurs of like ideological extremism and how they target millennials. Do you think there's any credence to the notion that extremism spreads easier or more quickly in communities that lack economic resources and political or human rights?
I mean, I know it's the thing that everybody wants to believe, and I have a really, I will just say, when 9/11 happened, the first thing we all said, you heard this in the press for weeks and weeks and weeks, the people had to be poor, they had to be uneducated, who would ever do something like this? The data just does not bear that out. I really wish it's this kind of person who dresses like this and whatever. It doesn't work like that. It's all about that emotional movement that is happening inside. And so you can see that there are people who are super well educated, absolutely affluent, who are leading these organizations, who are taking part in these organizations, who are doing crazy things like getting in planes and trying to blow up buildings. I mean, they're not fitting into the categories that we expect, including, by the way, when you begin to stereotype who you think they're going to be, you miss things. How did we miss the fact that girls were going to get recruited? Because all everybody thinks about when they think about Muslim women, they're not thinking about me. They're not thinking about somebody who looks like me. They have in their brain an idea of what that must be. We've got to be more creative about how we think about, unfortunately, what the bad guys are going to do next, and not be stereotypical and say this, this, and this. If in fact, sir, the research had shown us that it's this particular kind of person, I wouldn't be saying this. But because we have a whole, we have 13 and a half years worth of evidence to tell us a different story. And we are just on the heels yesterday of the second bombing in Boston. We know that it can happen anywhere. And you can see that in the things that we're watching on the news day in and day out. So the final thing I really would say is, unfortunately, we have to be more nimble because they are being more nimble and understanding who can be a recruit.
Well, Farah, I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk with us about what's going on, to take our questions here, and to invite all of us to be involved. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. We hope to see you at our next event very soon. Have a great evening.